Welcome to the afternoon meeting of June 9th, 2020, the Board of County Commissioners regular meeting. We had skipped over a couple of items which will from the morning time, which we'll go through in a little bit, but right now we have a 1:30 time certain, which is item 11A, public hearing and work session, FY fiscal year 20 to 2021, approved budget and work session on fiscal year 2021, budget adoption. And with us is Christine Mooney, our budget and financial planning manager.
Thank you, Chair Buck, members of the board. Just to maybe go through because we have a public hearing and a work session kind of wrapped into one item here, I'll just kind of give you a heads up that typically we will do the approved budget public hearing first. So that will be on the budget committee approved on May 21st. And then I have for you, you should have received via email, a handout that shows items that have been submitted by departments to be included in the adopted budget for next week. On Tuesday is when I'm scheduled to come back to you on that. And then we also have joining us today, Dan Hurley, our Public Works Director, so that we can provide you with a little bit more information on road fund reserves, which, as you'll remember, were a topic of discussion the evening that we approved the budget. So maybe to start with the public hearing piece, I'll just direct you to the information that you would have in your packet where we detailed, again, the changes that the Budget Committee made to the proposed budget. It was a decrease of just over $8 million. A lot of that related to COVID-related revenues coming in lower, and then adjusting expenses or reserves to take those into account. So that's all the comments I have prior to the public hearing.
Okay, so I don't have a script on this public hearing, but at this time it seems like it is appropriate to open that public hearing. And I can't personally see if we have anybody that's wants to speak during the public hearing, so I'll shift that over to the moderator.
Thank you, Chair Buck. At this time, if anyone who has registered and is attending this meeting, if you'll raise your virtual hand, we will call upon you to give testimony during public hearing. You will each be given 3 minutes to speak. I will unmute you, and once you see the timer start, you can begin speaking. Let me see. Our first speaker that I see would be Trey Carpenter. Trey, I will unmute you and I will start the timer. 1 moment.
Hi, can everybody hear me? So the budget proposes funding a new school resource officer for the Fern Ridge School District, specifically for Elmira High School. I come to you as someone who's had 2 sisters go through that high school. I come to you as the son of the current superintendent, and I come to you as a master's student in school psychology at the University of Oregon. This cannot be approved. Putting police officers in schools does nothing to create a safer learning environment. Putting a police officer into Elmira High School will achieve a few things. First, it will begin building a school-to-prison pipeline in our rural communities. Issues that should be handled by school administrators or counselors will instead be handled by a police officer. Issues that should result in a learning opportunity for students will instead result in an arrest record. Research has found that the presence of SROs has no impact on school safety, no impact on whether or not students feel safer, and results in a significant increase in suspensions, expulsions, and legal actions, particularly against the most vulnerable communities. Minneapolis and Portland have already committed to removing police presence in their school districts. This is a reality. It's already happening. You want to improve the school district? Instead of spending $130,000 on putting an officer in the school, hire new counselors. Hire a school psychologist who can work with students long-term instead of simply contracting out to Lane ESD for assessments as Fern Ridge currently does. If you want a research-based, forward-thinking, healthy environment for students, you cannot approve this expenditure. If you want literal children to be arrested, go right ahead. Thank you very much, and I yield my time.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next presenter will be Rigel. I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Rigel Williams. I will unmute you and reset the timer, and then you may start your public comment. One moment.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay,
Yes, we can.
thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Roger Williams. I live in Eugene. Today, I urge you all to use your position as county commissioners to promote safety, equity, and true justice in Lane County by divesting money from the sheriff's office in the upcoming budget and to instead use those funds to invest in programs that promote public welfare. A budget is a moral document, and that statement has never been more true than it is right now. We are in a historic moment when the most vulnerable members of our society are crying out for real change and are turning away from the business as usual attitudes that typically predominate. Many of us are heeding that call and demanding the immediate destruction of the racist, dehumanizing, and violent institutions that act as the enforcing arm of white supremacy in Lane County. These institutions include, but are not limited to, the sheriff's office, the jail, and the city police forces. Policing and incarceration do not provide for the public safety. In fact, the opposite is true. Police create violence where none would otherwise exist, and incarceration serves only to destabilize families and communities. Black, brown, and Indigenous folks are disproportionately the victims of state violence and bear the overwhelming burden resulting from the existence of the police and the carceral system. This cannot continue, and the time to act is now. Angela Davis once said, "A radical is simply one who grasps things at the root." And that's exactly what I'm asking of you here today, to start acting radically. Address the roots of the inequalities in our community by directing public funds towards housing, education, healthcare, and community services. Address the root cause of state violence and oppression by defunding and eliminating the policing agencies. Address the roots of white supremacy by tearing down all those institutions that perpetuate, benefit, and depend on such an aberrant state of affairs. Defund, disarm, and dismantle the police. Black Lives Matter. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker will be Evan Quarles. I will unmute you and reset the timer, and you may begin your public comment when the timer begins. One moment.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Evan Quarles. I'm a former philosophy graduate student currently living in Eugene. I want to speak in favor of the resolution passed earlier to support the Black Lives Matter movement. But in relation to the budget, I also want to emphasize that action rather than words is imperative and paramount in this historical moment. And not just any action, but rigorous and militant action to dismantle completely and entirely the infrastructure of the police, prisons, institutional and systematic racism, while also dismantling the carceral state, carceral capitalism, and carceral racism. Numerous Black, Indigenous, and organizers of color around the country, around the world, and in our communities have ceaselessly reminded us that reform has always been a failure, and the only solution is to defund and to dismantle, something that is required, necessary, but also and above all possible. The actions that we need from you now must go beyond reform, which puts more money, more power, and more infrastructure in the hands of the oppressors. The action that we need from you now must envision and embrace different futures, futures that will create communities that can hold each other accountable in reconciliatory ways without the police and the exploitative structures of race, class, and gender that they defend. We even have infrastructure here in Eugene with Cahoots, a reconciliatory community-based alternative to the police that is severely underfunded, even though they respond to 17% of all 911 calls. To continue, the actions that we need from you now must envision and embrace different futures that will redistribute wealth to communities that have been structurally deprived of autonomy, futures that will provide free and equitable housing, education, healthcare, mobility, and other opportunities for self-definition that can be made possible through divestment from police and prisons. If you commit to actions that will defund, disarm, and dismantle the police state that is currently responding with violence and impunity to nonviolent protests in Eugene, in Oregon and across this country, you all have a chance actually to make change rather than postponing solutions that can and must be implemented now. To repeat, you will have a chance actually to make change rather than gesturing with diffuse progressive rhetoric while oppressive and broken structures that have existed through the entire anti-Black history of this country, state, and city continue to exist in altered forms. They need to be dismantled. I want you to commit not only to equity within Lane County institutions, but also to divesting, defunding, and dismantling the police, prisons, and other oppressive, exploitative, and anti-Black institutions. Take one look at the racist anti-Black history of the police, the anti-Black history of prisons, and the anti-Black history of Oregon, and tell me that you can reform these institutions. Abolition now, Black Lives Matter. I yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you for your public testimony. Our next speaker will be Evan Bowers. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Marie Bowers. Marie, I will unmute you and I will restart the timer, and you may begin your public comment when the timer starts. 1 moment.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marie Bowers. I'm a farmer in Lane County, and I think I know most of you. I just wanted to come today and express my disappointment to see that the Lane County Board of Commissioners continues to refuse to reconsider their membership in the Association of ONC Counties. Also, I am very disappointed and frustrated that those of us in natural resources like myself and many others who've reached out to you guys over the last year to work to find consensus on issues, especially like the AOCC. And I've been told that you've heard us and you're open to reconsideration, but then to only really feel like that's just a pat on the head, so we will quietly go away. The refusal to be part of the AOCC really feels like divisive party politics rather than making a decision that's best for the rural part of the county and in actuality in the entire county. And from what I heard, you guys are cutting $8 million from your budget. So it would seem now more than ever, you guys should be advocating for the federal funds that are due to Lane County, either through sustainable timber harvest on federal lands or through secure rural schools funding. The county's decision to withdraw from AOCC sends a loud message that we don't need these funds. It sends an even louder message that our forestry community and the jobs and tax revenues we generate is not important. Currently, as we just heard in the last few testimonies, there are calls to defund the police. In places this has happened, the law enforcement has fell upon the county sheriffs. Can you say with confidence that our Lane County Sheriff is properly funded to handle this scenario? Again, if we were successfully advocating for sustainable yield harvest on ONC lands, we would be ready. And why aren't these funds a priority? Inevitably, county taxpayers will be asked to cover budget shortfalls or suffer the consequences of reduced services. When this happens, we should all remember the commissioners who decided to vacate the county seat at the table and walk away from vital forestry funds. Quite honestly, I look forward to the day when local government does what's best for the rural constituents and not just the urban activists. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for your public comments. Our next speaker will be Ty Williams. Ty, I will unmute you and I will reset the timer and your public comment time will begin. 1 moment.
Hi, my name is Ty Williams. I am in District 4. I would just first like to echo some of the earlier comments, specifically regarding the presence or the intended addition of a school resource officer to the Fern Ridge School District, which has been associated with school resource officers across the country have been associated with higher felony rates among youth in schools. And I think it is unacceptable to be trying to treat student problems that should be dealt with through counseling, through school psychologists, through therapy, with a punitive system. I would then specifically like to address the Lane County jails and corrections right now, which are currently overcrowded, and inmates right now are unable to receive proper hygiene to deal with coronavirus, and B, are not being spaced out enough. Nationally, there's been calls to reduce the number of inmates in jails. Currently, local inmates are unable to receive their constitutional rights to attorneys in private locations, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And the solution to deal with these kinds of issues is not to allocate more funding to corrections. It's not to try to, I don't know, somehow increase our jail capacity, because fundamentally we know that in the wealthiest country in the world that has the largest prison system in the world, that these punitive systems have not worked for us and do not reduce crime. So in order to deal with these things, we need to defund, dismantle the police, and we need to also address that in the carceral system by releasing prisoners who do not need to be in our county jails, and by reducing our inmate populations. I think that, and in doing so, we should be investing in community care measures like programs like Cahoots. I think it would be an imperative that the county seek to explore programs like Cahoots for a countywide dispatch system. And with that, I yield my time.
Thank you for your public comments. Our next speaker is Rachel Hammock. Rachel, I will unmute you and reset the timer. When the timer begins, you may begin your public comment. 1 moment.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Hi. I would like to address a current petition that is going around on change.org asking for the City Council to allocate 30% of the Eugene PD's funds to Cahoots. I personally am very much so in favor of this suggestion. It is a suggestion for real change. That is a concrete thing that the Commission could easily pass and do today. By allocating 30% of Eugene PD funds to Cahoots, we are going to be funding an institution that deals with the 90% of nonviolent crimes that are happening in the city. Currently, our violent crime rate is only 10%. Only 3 of those crimes annually last year were murders. And the fact that I've lived in the city for almost 2 decades. I moved here from Los Angeles when I was 7 years old to get a better education. The fact that my officer for my middle school and high school ended up being outed as a rapist made me feel very unsafe as a student. And the fact that the City Council is currently suggesting putting police officers into schools is a very huge concern for me as a citizen of this town. I'm very proud to be from this city, but I'm also very ashamed of the fact that all I've been seeing for the last almost 20 years is a lot of talk and no change. I encourage the commissioners to look into real solutions that are being suggested by the people. When we say disarm, defund, and dismantle the police, we are not talking about an unrealistic expectation. We are talking about a real opportunity for change. All of the funds that are currently being allocated to Eugene PD could very easily be transferred to Cahoots, to warming centers, to help our unhoused population, 300 of which just got put onto the streets due to the Lane County emergency shelter being shut down with little to no notice. That is disgraceful. That is something that makes me not proud to live here. The way we treat our addicts in this town and the way we treat our unhoused people is despicable. And for a town that claims to be a liberal mecca, it does not feel like one. I encourage all of the commissioners to actually research and look into what we mean when we say to defund and dismantle the police. Because what we are asking is for you to allocate those funds back into social services where they should have been in the first place. I'll allocate my time. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. At this time, I do not see that anyone else has raised their hand for public comment. I think a few people have joined our meeting after we called for public comment. So if you would raise your hand now, I will call upon you and see. I'm going to see if I have any more hands up. I see one more hand, Kaylee Harris. Oh, I see a few more hands going up. Kaylee Harris, at this time, I will unmute your microphone and I will reset the timer and your public comment time will begin. 1 moment.
Hello. Sorry, this is my first time doing this, but I do feel very strongly about not having police in our education systems. There have been studies done in Texas that said that not only did students of color have test scores drop but it also hurt graduation rates, as well as college attendance rates. And I also think that we should allocate some of the 64 million that was approved to go to the sheriff's office towards community programs to help, as other people have said, addiction, to help housing, and especially education that needs actual education and supported teachers and counselors rather than police enforcement. And I think overall we need to defund police because they address a lot of issues and are overwhelmed trying to not only police people, but also take care of social problems that should be solved in other directions. I also support having a cahoots-like system put in place countywide. Thank you very much. I yield my time.
Thank you for your public comment. I have two more people on queue. I have KW Lau and Sophie Bybee and Samuel Allig just joined. So at this time, I will unmute Sophie Bybee and reset the timer. One moment.
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Sophie and I live in Eugene, Oregon. And I also wanted to address the budget that is under review currently for next fiscal year. Crime isn't random. Most of the time it happens when someone has been unable to meet their basic needs through other means. That means that once someone has come in contact with the police, we as a society have already failed them. By shifting money away from the police and towards services that actually meet those needs, we will be increasing the safety of our communities and quality of life of our community members. And it's not just that police are ineffective as support in our communities, they are actually actively harmful. When we see egregious acts of police brutality against Black and brown bodies, we are seeing the system act exactly as it was designed to, in upholding white supremacy. When we fund the police, we fund this systematic violence. And when we fund the police and corrections in the budget at such a high level as is currently proposed for next fiscal year, we are downright endorsing it. We understand that defunding cannot happen all at once. We need community services in place and expanded in tandem. But the fact that we're having these conversations at the end of the current fiscal year gives us an incredible opportunity to begin. Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next presenter will be Samuel Allig. I will unmute you and reset the timer, and you may begin your public comment.
Hi there, can you all hear me? Okay. I just want to second that I really agree with proposing that 30% of Eugene police funds go to cahoots. There's a need for creative solutions that look at the underlying reasons of crime, and specifically homelessness, which is not a crime. Individuals experiencing homelessness are citizens that have rights, and police are just not trained in the right ways to help with mental health problems or drug addiction or other underlying reasons in meaningful ways. And as I'm sure you're aware, the houseless issue here in Eugene is not getting better. So I just want to advocate for defunding the Eugene Police Department and reallocating those funds to fighting underlying causes of homelessness, drug addiction, mental illness, and other, other types of crime here in town. And also, I feel that placing more police in our schools is absolutely the wrong approach. Again, funds need to be reallocated to finding meaningful solutions that are addressing the underlying issues. And we need to focus on prevention, not policing. And I think that's all I've got to say here, so I'll yield my time. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your public comment. I see a couple more people have joined. Our next speaker will be KW Lau. I will go ahead and unmute your microphone and you may begin your public comment when the timer resets. Thank you.
Hello, my name is KW Lau, and I am a concerned community member of color here in Eugene. So kind of following a lot of the comments that were already put, in stating resource officers at school campuses are not a good idea. We should really reevaluate with our budget who the first responders to crises are. And oftentimes a lot of the crises that happen in Eugene do not require having an armed person being there to attend to their needs. Oftentimes we have services that are already existing that can serve our community members' needs. There has been a community member who spoke out about how they were arrested and detained for 5 hours just because they were walking around in their home neighborhood. And they were detained for 5 hours with the police suggesting and demanding that they are having a mental health crisis, despite having the medical professional saying that she is not in a mental health crisis. This is one of the examples in which Eugene Police Department has violated the rights and civil rights of our community members, people who are paying taxes here. Another aspect is to demilitarize the police is to, again, remove the weapons. And I think one of the big things we can do is, as we are demilitarizing the police, we are using the funds that we have collected from either selling our surplus items to then fund the programs that are supposed to be the de-escalation team, such as Cahoots, 15th Night, Ophelia's Place, Looking Glass, Vegan Warming Centers. Thank you for listening. I yield my time.
Thank you for your public comment. I have two more speakers, and that would be Sarah Bennett and Natalie Sieben. I will call Sarah Bennett and unmute you, and let me reset the timer and your public comment can begin. One moment.
Hi, can you hear me? All right, hi, I come as another first-time caller and am learning how to get involved in these processes. And I, along with nearly everyone who has spoken, want to see us as a city defund, disarm, and dismantle the police force, as well as the carceral institutions that are clearly racist and anti-life. But I can't say it better than other people have said it. One thing I do really clearly want to say is that I'm seeing more and more people in my generation and younger who are coming out and getting involved politically and getting involved in the streets in ways that are really unprecedented and that, like, we weren't taught how to do by our older generations. And I really want to say that we are not going to be appeased by reform measures, by the police department coming out and saying nice things to us about how they don't want to be racist. Like, we're not going to be appeased by that. We're not going to let up. We're watching you guys who hold the power, and we need to listen to us and make actual tangible changes. And the budget is obviously a very tangible change that you can push for. I also just want to second that I want the 30% of EPD funds to be reallocated to Cahoots. And I do not want to see any police officers added to our schools. That does not make us feel safer. And with that, I yield my time. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. I show our last speaker is Natalie Sieben. Natalie, I will unmute you and reset the timer and your public comment may begin. One moment.
Hi there, can you hear me? Thanks so much. So I'm Natalie Hebben. I'm a speech language pathologist with Lane Education Service District and a permanent resident of Eugene. I wanted to be more eloquent, but I just found out about this meeting, so I have a few points. First, I have a friend who was tear gassed during the curfew, the weekend while sheltering in place during the weekend of the curfew. And he was inside his home in downtown Eugene. This friend showed me a video of one canister firing into his apartment patio. This happened while Eugene police were shooting gas canisters, rubber bullets, and other so-called less lethal weapons at pedestrians indiscriminately, despite the fact that people were doing their job or moving to and from work were supposed to be exempt from the curfew. When one journalist said, "I'm a journalist," the Eugene officer in front of her said, "I don't care." also have heard Eugene police officers saying racist things when they think they're not being recorded. So a polite statement and minor reform measures are just not going to cut it, like others have said. Our local police departments don't need riot gear, and in fact, providing these weapons and training police in their use creates the expectation and desire to use those weapons. I think we should cut all funding for riot gear and similar weapons because they're unnecessary, and a militarized police force means an oppressive one. We need to stop enabling our police departments to buy military surplus weapons, and we need to close all connections between our police departments and the military industrial complex. And from a budget standpoint, maybe you guys can do something about that. While we're at it, Whitebird Cahoots, as others have said, receives 1.3%, I believe, of the Eugene Police budget, while they respond to 17% of police calls. They're trained in trauma-informed care, and these incidents have much better outcomes than similar calls handled by police, as issues are resolved with less violence and better connection with mental health services. Imagine what Cahoots could do with much more of the police budget. I've also heard Springfield PD is cutting funding from its police body camera program, and it's hiding this particular cut under the larger umbrella of COVID-19 budget cuts. I need to push back on that and any motions that undercut transparency. We should be enhancing our accountability measures, including the use of body cams, and not cutting them. I'm also generally disturbed by the lack of training in racial sensitivity, white privilege, and trauma-informed care in our public service community. White privilege is a fact of history and modern American life. It is not a political opinion. I think we need to mandate training in all these areas, at the very least for all police, but really I think any public servants, especially administrative level, who are making major decisions should also have training in these areas. And I encourage you all to take your own initiative to look into racial sensitivity, white privilege, and trauma-informed care. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your public comment. We did have one more person raise their hand in the interim. Mackenzie Myers, I will go ahead and unmute you and reset the timer, and you may begin your public comment. One moment.
Hi all, can you hear me? Great, thank you. Thank you for being here today. I just want to add to the host of comments that people have had before and kind of put my word in for efforts to defund the police. You all can take very tangible efforts on this front and lead in nationwide and international efforts on this. And Eugene can be an example community following in the footsteps of Minneapolis, and especially since Eugene already has the infrastructure in place with Cahoots. I think this has been mentioned before. This can lead to a very seamless transition and allocate funds directly from Eugene PD directly to Cahoots and engage in these kind of national efforts for justice and liberation. So I would just encourage you all to think about those and allocate those funds elsewhere. And I advocate the rest of my time. Thank you for your time here.
Thank you for your public comment. Chair Buck, at this time, I do not see anyone else with their hand raised for public comment, so that will conclude this portion of the meeting.
Okay, thank you everyone for your comment, and also for those that have been first-time callers or first-time people getting involved, I want to thank you for that. Before we get into a commissioner conversation for the rest of the this session, I want to give staff an opportunity to talk about any wrap-up items after hearing public comment. Mr. Mokerheisky, do you have something you might want to add?
I believe the sheriff is on the call, so it may be, I think it'd be great if we could have the sheriff. I know Commissioner Bozovich has also been involved in discussions related to the, with the city of Veneta and the Fern Ridge School District related to the school resource officer that was referenced. So some clarity around the funding for that proposed position and the likelihood of that proposed position coming to fruition. So if the sheriff, I'm not sure, Diana, can we unmute the sheriff?
I don't show the sheriff is on.
if he is not on, we might also need some clarity between the difference between EPD and the county budget. And then
Sure.
if there isn't any other staff comment, we'll go to commissioners.
Sure, and I can just say if we're not able to hear from the sheriff, to say that it's my understanding that the position being referenced, the school resource officer position, was requested by the Fern Ridge School District and was proposed to be funded by the Fern Ridge School District and the city of Veneta with state funds that were made available by the legislature. There is some question about whether or not those state funds would actually will actually come through, and the likelihood of that position being funded. But I do know that it is this came at the request of, it's my understanding, students, counselors in the school district and the city of Veneta, and was being funded by those entities and at their request. And then also, Chair, just to clarify for speakers that today's meeting is a public hearing of the Lane County Board of Commissioners, responsible for the Lane County Board of Commissioners are the 5 elected officials that comprise the governing body of Lane County, which represents around 370,000 residents throughout the county, and does not have any affiliation with the, we certainly work with the Eugene Police Department and the city of Eugene, as we do with police departments and the 11 cities and multiple police departments throughout the county, but we don't have any jurisdiction over the city of Eugene or the Eugene Police Department. So I'm not sure if we were able to get the sheriff. I know we were trying to get the.
I am inviting the sheriff right now. He's working on joining.
Okay.
It might take him a moment if you want to go on to something else for a minute.
Sure. So why don't we do any comments or conversation now, and then we'll try to get the sheriff on here in a moment. Commissioner.
And Chair, I just
yes.
cut in 1 second to say we do have a presentation we're planning to give from our Public Works Director and Budget Manager related to the road fund. So we do have that staff presentation whenever you're ready. Certainly, I think it's totally appropriate if you want to take questions on public comment and hear from the sheriff first.
The sheriff is now on.
Hello, board. Sheriff Cliff Harold here. I've been listening to your meeting. Of course, it's slightly delayed by watching it on the webcast. And so while Diana was helping me behind the scenes to be able to speak to you, I may have missed a part of the conversation. I did hear Mr. Mokrahysky start to share some of the information about how we received the request through Fern Ridge School District to add an SRO in their district. And so we've had a number of conversations. I've participated in public meetings with both the school district as well as the city of Veneta with respect to this particular position. And the city of Veneta did vote to add it. However, we all recognize that state revenues are possibly not what the school district thought they would be when we first had the conversations. At this point, they're still expressing a desire to add the position, but are waiting for additional information on their revenues. And so we have just all agreed that while the position may exist as far as allocation and authorization to add the position, we may not actually add it until the school actually determines if they have the revenue or not. So hopefully that provides clarity on the SRO position. Happy to take any questions.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thanks very much. I just wonder if Christine could answer this question for us about the budget. If we left that out of the budget, and then it was later determined that the state does have the resources. Could we amend the budget and put that position back in?
Thank you, Commissioner Sorensen. Yes, a contract can be added to the budget via regular board order, or it could be done in a supplemental budget.
It seems to me that, and this is directed to the commissioners, it seems to me that since there is some doubt about whether the funds will come in, we could avoid having a fight today over this by simply agreeing that if the funds are made available and the board's informed and the city and the school district and the sheriff all want to move forward, then the board can either hold another public hearing on the topic or just approve an amended budget. But I don't really see the need to have a fight over whether we are or not going to spend money that we don't know even exists.
Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. So the decision to add a school resource officer was a long process by the Fern Ridge School District in the city of Anita, and started with gathering public comment about what they would do with the additional money they're getting from the Student Success Act. And in those conversations, they involved the student bodies of the schools, and the students voted for their top two priorities. And one was a school resource officer and the other was additional counseling. And those two things were in their budget of the district. But the district knew they couldn't afford and don't have full-time year-round employment for a school resource officer. So they approached the city of Veneta to utilize that school resource officer as a regular Veneta patrol officer during the summertime and have that connection and also the supervision through the Veneta sergeant. So that's, what's gone on over time with this. Both the city of Veneta and the school district have adopted their budgets with this position in it at this time. And right now, they haven't been told that the Student Success Act money is not coming. That was actually an amount of money that was provided to the districts and was an application that the districts had to make back to the state to get that money. And this position was included in that. I don't think we would be very good partners of two local agencies if we pull this money from the budget right now. Just as Commissioner Sorensen pointed out, we can amend the budget to eliminate a position and the funding. It's actually not our funds, it's somebody else's funds. Very easily if it turns out that they don't materialize. But I do think that there's been a long public process in this area, discussing exactly this position, and parents and students of the district understand it. They actually held, public meetings by the school board. The city of Veneta held public meetings, which I attended, where they discussed and put this position into their budget. So, if we decide, now we're just, a position that we're not funding, because it's a contract position with the sheriff's office, just as if the city of Veneta decided to add one more deputy, would we suddenly make a preemptive decision to say, we don't want the contract with the city of Veneta and eliminate that position unilaterally? I think there needs to be a discussion with those agencies before we unilaterally eliminate a contract deputy.
Commissioner Burney?
On this particular subject, a couple of points, because the vast majority of the public input were from people weighing in on this. First, forgive me, but I'm going to act like an educator for a moment. If you're going to, as I have in my life, if you're going to try and work for social justice, good to have all the facts. So in this particular instance of this officer, Commissioner Bozievich really identified the governing bodies that made that decision. Their request to the county wasn't that we put $1 in and we're not. It was that they contract to hire what they said they wanted. Now, do you agree with the decision that city and the student body made? It sounds like you don't. Do I? No, I actually don't either. I agree with you. I don't believe that a police presence in schools makes schools safer. And I'm someone that, God, I don't even know how many decades ago was involved in a National Institute of Education and Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention study on what made violent schools safer. Nonetheless, please know, you're talking to the wrong people on that one. Number two, for the person that discussed Springfield, which I'm from, and body cams being taken out of the budget being submitted, actually, as of last night, you are incorrect. I spoke at a rally which agreed with your point that accountability is enhanced by body cams. And last night, the Springfield Budget Committee decided to keep that entire line item into the budget they are submitting to the city of Springfield for approval next Monday night. I've also heard from many people that have said, do people really think anyone wants to defund the police? And I think the input today suggests, yes, a lot of people feel that way. But what that means and the details and the process of that and how that means changing priorities is a whole other discussion. And finally, before I was ever a commissioner, this Board of County Commissioners, because of lack of money, essentially did defund a good amount of sheriff's patrols, not in the city of Eugene, that's not where we have that jurisdiction over, but in rural areas. So right now, 4 deputy patrols are covering a county the size of Connecticut. So in a sense, we are dealing with what you all are advocating, but not for the reasons that you're advocating it. So those were the comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. You know, I would that I could have some input regarding how the City of Eugene police dollars are spent. I would direct them to spend them a little bit more attuned to what the Sheriff's Department spends their money on. And I call out to mental health specialists in the jail. I call out to much of the training that our sheriff's deputies have and the time that the sheriff and much of his staff spend in the mental health summit every month. So, but however, while I did conduct the City of Eugene Police Department's budget for 10 years, I don't do that anymore. The other thing I'd like to say is that, Marie Bowers, thank you for your testimony.
If people could mute, that would be great so we can hear one person at a time. Commissioner Farr, go ahead.
I was completed, thank you, but I'm not going to yield my time.
Okay. On this particular item for public comment, if I hadn't done so already, I'll just acknowledge that we've closed public comment on this particular item. And it seems like staff has additional presentation to make. So if you want to take it away and make that presentation now, and then we can finish up our conversation after.
Christine, do you want me to do the intro, or do you have anything you want to say?
Well, I actually would like to just to very briefly point the board towards the handout that you received probably about 2 hours ago. And it is the draft adjustments that, yeah, Diana has brought it up for us. Draft adjustments that departments have submitted. So changes to the approved budget. And this would be the time for the board also to weigh in on if you want me to also include anything else in the adoption order that I would bring back next week. But I'll just very briefly let you know that the 2 departments that have submitted changes are Public Works and Health and Human Services. Public Works, typically you will see them budgeting a rebudget of projects that they don't complete in the prior fiscal year. So they're moving money forward for those and those related expenses. They also have a couple of adjustments related to changes that they're making in Supplemental Budget 4 that you will see next week. So making sure that the 2021 budget looks the same way now that they have additional information. Health and Human Services, you'll see that there's quite a few changes in our Fund 285, which is our Intergovernmental Human Services Fund, the addition of 7 3/4 FTE, some of those FTE being added in 1920. So this is bringing them into 2021, continuing them. But there is the add of 2 FTE, a program services coordinator, using funding that was originally set aside for the Shelter and Navigation Center, and then also some COVID revenue. So that's something that has changed. And then there's just a slight adjustment to the general fund at the top of the sheet for that FTE being added. And I'm open for any questions on that, but I just wanted to make sure that you saw those. They will come back as being included in the adoption order next week unless you direct me otherwise.
Any questions or comments on that from anybody? I don't see anything. Okay.
So with that, I think we are ready, Steve, for you to introduce the next item.
Okay. So just a brief introduction. Dan Hurley and Tanya Heaton, I believe, are with us, and they're going to walk through a few slides. We don't typically do this at this public hearing, but given the fact that there was some, I would say, a healthy amount of confusion on the budget deliberation night of when the budget committee met about the reserve funds in the road fund. We talked a lot about these different pools of reserve funds that exist, the SRS related reserve fund, and then the non-SRS related reserve fund in the road fund, what those are comprised of, some difference of interpretation of the board order that was approved a couple of years ago related to the use of those funds and the tracking of those funds. And so what we wanted to do today was walk through that so that you get a clearer picture, particularly for the newer commissioners who haven't had the benefit of this overview, clear picture of the reserves that exist. Important to know that our reserve fund requirements in the road fund are higher than they are in our other operating funds because we have this $1 billion asset in roads and bridges that we have to maintain. So we need to have a higher level reserve. We also will talk about, we've had a lot of conversations at the staff level about funding for sheriff patrols, and Commissioner Burney brought this up. There are 4 deputies. You would talk about underfunding of law enforcement. We have an underfunded sheriff's office as it relates to patrol. 4 deputies patrolling a county the size of the state of Connecticut. So our rural residents certainly know that we don't have the ability, the sheriff's office doesn't have the staffing to respond to the calls for service that they need to. That's a real challenge in terms of maintaining basic public safety services in Lane County. So we want to walk through again the road and just we'll clarify a few things. There is $1 million per year in road fund SRS or timber related funding, that federal funding related to timber that is being transferred every year. $1 million from the road fund that gets transferred to help fund patrol. That is what allows us to maintain a 24/7 patrol operation. Although we only have 4 officers per shift, there was a time before we were doing that we didn't have a 24/7 patrol operation. So now we do, because we have this annual SRS or annual timber fund payment to the road fund that gets transferred over to help fund patrol. So the outstanding question has been, how do we utilize the SRS related funds that are in reserve for the road fund? There was some discussion, and Commissioner Bozevich had proposed an amendment that ultimately did not get taken up during the budget committee process. Staff is going to be, the board would need to make this amendment, but we are proposing to spend the $2.5 million for the territorial project out of the non-SRS funds, and then utilize the SRS reserve, the stabilization reserve, for COVID-19 revenue declines. So I know this is, I'm throwing a lot at you without showing you slides, but Dan and Tanya will walk through all of that, and just wanted to set the context for this conversation. And then I will finally just say that we I'm happy to answer questions about this after the presentation, but I've also been in conversations with the sheriff over the last few weeks. We continue to work on a longer term proposal for basic rural patrol needs to allow the sheriff's office to be able to reach that stage 2, that phase 2 public safety, 10-year public safety plan that was discussed during the process. So we're not prepared to bring that forward quite yet, but that is being developed and in process right now. So I'll turn it over to Dan and Tanya, and then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Steve, and good afternoon, Chair Buck and Commissioners. So we're going to talk about the road fund reserves. So the road fund reserve policy is outlined in Lane Manual Chapter 4, and in that policy, it directs the department to maintain a minimum 40% reserve based on anticipated operating revenue. And the purpose of this is to ensure that we have adequate cash flow and to maintain service levels during severe economic downturns and to provide funds in the event of an unforeseen event such as a natural disaster or an asset failure that would require us to replace an asset, for example. In that policy, it breaks that 40% down into 3 buckets here. The emergency reserve, the first 17%, in the case of an emergency related to revenue or an emergency related to disaster. And same thing with the catastrophic reserve. Similar circumstances where those might be used, but at differing level of degree to provide for funds to replace an asset or repair an asset. That third one, and we'll be talking more about this one in the proposal, is the Service Asset and Stabilization Reserve. This is to provide stable funds in case of a severe economic downturn, which is what we're experiencing right now with COVID-19. So that's the additional, what would be 8% out of that 40% reserve. In addition to these 3 pots here, which are our minimum reserves, which are now made up of SRS timber revenue, as previously directed by the board, we have this reserve for future projects, which I think of as our sort of our working reserve. This is generated through one-time discretionary funds, such as if our expenditures are less than budgeted, if we have a delay in a project, this is where our fund balance carryover goes. And so it's important to keep an adequate level in these reserves, and that was my concern during the deliberations. In the case of growing expenses for new projects, if a project needs to be added, it would come out of this reserve for future projects, which has been called our mixed reserves, because it may contain some amount of SRS. We haven't gone through the detailed accounting to try to pull that out, but primarily state money, but could also be federal money and grant money. When we look at the road fund structure, we have 3 buckets within that. So the road fund operations, that's our primary fund. It's number 225 that funds all of our road work maintenance and our capital projects. Then we have a fairly new fund, 226, which is the Territorial Sub Fund. We set that up to be able to track Territorial separately because over time we'll be receiving $30 million from the state for the improvements and maintenance on that road, which we know at this point is not going to be nearly enough to do the improvements that are necessary there. To date, we've received $5 million there, which has been earmarked for the maintenance of the 40 miles of additional road that we need to maintain for Territorial. We're not going to be talking about that one much unless you bring it up and we have further discussions. We'll be primarily focusing on the first one and this third one. The third one there is the Fund 227. This is our Federal Forest SRS sub-fund to receive and track our SRS and federal timber revenue separately as previously directed by the board. We're doing that now. This slide here represents a summary of our reserves from the approved budget. And so if I take this column by column, you'll see in that 225, our mixed reserves, we have a little over $7 million there. And I want to point out that 3.1 of that has already been earmarked. In that previous board order that was discussed, we outlined a funding plan to draw down our reserves and spend the SRS money. So there's $3.150,000, $3,150,000 that's in the earmarked and to be spent in the upcoming fiscal year for specific projects. So we will be doing that to carry out that third part of the board order to fulfill what had been previously directed by the board. That second column there is our SRS fund. And you can see the first three lines of that. That's what totals, which is written down below there, that 14.3 million, which establishes those minimum reserve levels that I already spoke about. Beyond that 40% minimum, there was that 589,000 in excess, which had not been allocated. And so then you can see the totals there. So looking at the lines below there, we talked about the 40%, what was remaining, and the amount that had been dedicated to that fiscal year 18-19 spending plan, and then what is remaining in the mixed reserves. This next slide contains the two technical adjustments that we are proposing from the approved budget. So the first one there, if you go down to the Road Fund Economic Stability-COVID, we're proposing moving $2.7 million out of the Service Asset and Stabilization Reserve, because that's the point of that reserve, is to have those funds available when there's a severe economic downturn. We're experiencing that now. We're actually expecting about $3.7 million of reduced revenue from the state highway revenues we typically received due to COVID. With all the less driving, the economic downturn, we're seeing a significant reduction in revenue there. So this is the purpose of those reserves. And so to align with that purpose, proposing to move that funding out to shore up the ability to sustain the projects that we had planned. The second line there, the Territorial Highway, we had originally proposed to use the remaining SRS money for Territorial Highway. As I mentioned, the costs for Territorial Highway are exceeding the ODOT estimates. This first part, this first improvement we are planning for Territorial Highway at Stony Point has kind of ballooned in expense from an initial $2 million to a little over $4 million at this point. So we're looking at taking part of the SRS funds to fund that project. We just received the bids today on that project, and they were even higher, another $600,000 higher than we had estimated. So we are currently reviewing that project. If will move forward in this fiscal year, we need to do some more work on that. But we wanted to pull that out of the SRS funding there to leave that discretionary SRS funding for other potential uses. This final slide, actually one more after this, is a graphical depiction of those technical adjustments. So the road fund minimum reserve would drop from 40% to 32.5%. So that's that green bar shown on the two bars there, the approved budget to the technical adjustment bar. You can see that green going down. This keeps in place those next two. The gray is the SRS discretionary reserves that have been earmarked from, oh, sorry, I spoke incorrectly. The 3.1 is, help me out, Tanya, I'm lost train of thought here.
The 3.1 is the gray, and
okay.
It stays the same in both.
Okay, thanks. And then the yellow was our discretionary reserves.
The road fund discretionary reserves, and then the blue is the secure rural schools.
I should look at my notes here. sorry, let me start over there. So the green is going down with the COVID impact. This next line here, the 3.1, is the blue. It's going up. And so that one's going up. So that one was going to be reduced with the Territorial project. We're putting that back in to be used for the board's discretionary uses. That next bar there, so the 3.1, 3,150,000, is the part that earmarked in the fiscal year 18-19 plan. And then that reserves, that keeps that yellow, the discretionary mixed reserves, the same at that 4.3 million. Sorry, I got lost train of thought there on that one. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much. And then finally, the last slide there, just wanted to talk about the reasons, why we're trying to keep that yellow part, the road fund discretionary part, intact, and why we're making these proposals. So one is just economic stability. I talked about with the COVID impacts and the reduction in the revenue we get from gas taxes in particular. So we're estimating 3.7 million over the 2 fiscal years. We really don't know what the future is with COVID, if we're going to have a resurgence in the fall that could make that even higher. So we have some significant concerns. The state continues to forecast funding, and it looks pretty bleak. Transportation assets, wanted to talk about. So Territorial Highway, we need to come back to the board soon and talk about Territorial Highway. We have some significant concerns there of the long-term needs for capital investments on our 40 miles of new roadway that we need to maintain. Local access roads has been a conversation with the board for many months now. We have 123 miles of local access roads that are not being maintained and continue to degrade. And those are left as the responsibility of the adjacent property owners, which is inadequate in most cases. So we need to figure out how we prioritize those roads and if there are certain roads that should be brought into the county road system. Asset management is a project that we've been moving on for over a year now to implement a comprehensive software to manage our assets. We're very excited that we've gotten to a point where we're piloting 2 modules, and in the fall, we're expecting a full go live. So we should be able to provide you with more data, provide us with more data on how we should manage our assets to make sure that we're investing at the right point in time and with the right method for maintaining our road assets. Federal funding is really up in the air right now with all the COVID impacts. We don't know if there will be a reduction in money we typically receive from the federal government, such as the FLAP program, the Federal Land Access Program. So we could be receiving less revenue through federal government, but we could be receiving more. There's the INVEST Act that was recently proposed by Congressman DeFazio, and it's hopeful that we might be able to tap into that. And then I've already discussed state funding quite a bit, really up in the air and what's going to happen long-term with that. And then finally, stormwater. We just recently had a conversation with the board at your previous meeting talking about the significant concerns there with a tripling of expenses we're expecting over the next about 5 years due to our new stormwater permit. So those are some of the future challenges and opportunities. And at this point, I'd like to turn it to your question.
Okay, thank you. There was a lot in there. And the interesting thing for me is as we're talking about road funds and maintaining them, and I have the county road crew right outside my door doing their work. So I'll open it up for discussion amongst the commissioners. Anybody have any comments or questions? Commissioner Bolshevik.
Thank you, and I appreciate this coming back to the board again, because it did seem like there's a little bit of lack of history on some of this. One of the things I want to point out is SRS money can be used for everything that the discretionary mixed reserves can be used for. They're interchangeable as far as our ability to spend them on road and stormwater projects. bridges, whatever, that's completely flexible for public works. The difference between the two is there is a state law that allows us to spend federally derived money from our federal forest also on patrol services. So there is some more flexibility with the SRS money. So that's the biggest difference between those two things. Really, what we have is a required minimum reserve, that 40% that we want to maintain, and then additional reserves. And the question is out of that, which do you spend first? Do you spend the money that has less restrictions first or more restrictions first? And it's about an overall strategy for what's best for the county. And as a commissioner, I have to think about what's best for the county. There is nothing that says SRS money can't be placed into our mandated 40% reserves. There's nothing that says it can't be part of our future projects. It's just that it has some additional flexibility. That was why I was asking to spend the mixed reserves first. And I will be the first one that will tell you our 40% reserve is not enough. And I will fight spending those reserves on recurring expenses, even if it's patrol, because we currently are not spending enough in operational money. And that 40% is based on our operational budget. We have a $6 billion asset out there in our roads, bridges, culverts, and signs that are out there in our road system. The 40% we're carrying right now is a drop in the bucket if we have a major event. That portion that is catastrophic is a small amount of money set aside for coming back from a major catastrophe. Our emergency reserves, our 8% reserves, all of that is really not enough. Looking at the fact that we just got a report on the whole issue of stormwater spending that's going to have to increase to maintain our ability to meet standards for clean water in our communities. I think that was something like $8 million over the next 5 years of increased spending. That pretty well takes a lot of that reserve away if we don't find some other funding source. So I'm sort of happy that it was chosen to have that conversation about moving into phase 2 and using reserves later, because that's a very long conversation for me. Everybody knows I've been somebody that's constantly advocated for some need to improve rural patrol, but I am loath to take one-time reserve money and utilize it for ongoing expenses of hiring additional deputies, particularly knowing how restricted this reserve is. The only thing I'm asking is for Public Works to kind of get past this. For them, they don't see the SRS money as their most flexible money. They're looking at it from a Public Works lens. And the fact that it can be diverted to the sheriff's office makes it less flexible in their mind. So they're constantly fighting to spend that first. And I'm just asking them to think about the entire team of Lane County and the fact that we want to have the most flexible reserves we can. I will fight like a dog not to dig into those reserves because they're so meager as it starts with. But I want the most flexible dollars in those reserves. And that's why I made the motion I did was going to make the motion, but then had to withdraw it because so many new budget committee members didn't understand the difference between SRS money and non-SRS money. And we're getting confused about how it could be spent, that I had to pull back because there was no way the motion was going to pass. But I'm hoping that we can get to something that says we're not going to indiscriminately pull some of that SRS money out for territorial when we could be using mixed money that's less flexible for the entire county's budget.
Any other comments? Questions? Well, I just have to add that this is pretty technical, and I'm still wrapping my head around each section of this to try to get to the root of the issue. You know, at first glance, if we're trying to use money for a project, I would use the ones that are dedicated to that type of work first, before I would use the most flexible kinds of funds. But then I kind of get the feeling that there are different definitions of what is flexible between folks. And that might be an even longer conversation, and perhaps talk about that more when we're looking at the Territorial Highway issue. Commissioner Burney.
I recall there was another reason that did not move forward, and that reason was there seemed to be a difference of opinion from senior staff on that one. And so I want to know what is being proposed here, and is it different than what the Budget Committee moved forward with, which in this instance was not what Commissioner Bozovich wanted? And if it's not different, why not, given this discussion?
So this, what,
Commissioner,
do you want to
go ahead,
take
Steve.
this? Okay, let me just, so what's being proposed is different than what the Budget Committee approved. It includes spending $2.5 million for the territorial project out of the non-SRS reserves, as Dan called them, the mixed reserves, which is arguably less flexible, in order to allow the SRS reserves, which are arguably more flexible, to remain there. So that's one change. Does that make sense? That was the amendment that Commissioner Bozovich was proposing on budget deliberation night. And then the second change is spending $2.7 million out of the stabilization reserve, a portion of the 40% reserve for COVID-19 impacts. So, and this was based on conversations at the staff level, the same senior staff that you are referring to, Commissioner Burney, who had concerns about the depletion of the mixed reserve, because the concern was that those really are the funds intended for projects. And in our conversations after the Budget Committee deliberation, it was determined that really it makes more sense for us to spend out of the stabilization reserve for the expected decrease in revenue as a result of COVID-19. Does that make sense? Because we're this is the point of a stabilization. We have three different reserves, three different accounts that make up that 40%: emergency reserve, catastrophic reserve, and stabilization. The stabilization piece of that is intended, and I think, Dan, what did we say? That's around $3 million in the stabilization piece. That is intended for a period of time in which we have declining revenues. And that is this period of time. So that's the other piece that was not really discussed during the Budget Committee process, but I think we at the staff level became enlightened around, really it makes sense for us to leave the reserves that are intended for future capital projects intact, and then spend the 40% minimum reserves that are more for emergency purposes for a portion of what we're dealing with, because we really are in an emergency. I hope that makes sense. I know this is rather.
No, for me it did. I just, if I may, and by the way, I don't know if you all remember that night, but I'm starting to call it Budgegeddon. That was a long one. Commissioner Bozovich, forgive me, but this question is to you. Is this closer and more consistent with what you were where you were trying to get to for the reasons you enumerated, or no?
Yes, it is. you know, if I was to draw the boxes a little bit differently, I would have been pulling the 2.7 probably from the gray box and leaving the green alone. But that's just more semantics than anything. As long as it was not coming out of the SRS reserves, the 3-something million that was going to go to Territorial Highway. It just seemed not in the best interest of the county to spend our most flexible reserves on a project. And I think this kind of does that. So I really appreciate that the folks at Public Works are working with me on that. And you know, like I said, I'm one of the folks that's going to fight for their reserves because as an engineer, I understand that it's really not an adequate reserve, and that we're currently not spending enough money operationally on maintenance and continuing upkeep of our $6 billion asset.
Well, thank you, Steve and Dan and Commissioner, because actually now I'm very clear on this. So thank you very much, at least for me.
Any other comments or questions, Commissioner Farr?
Thank you. I agree with the direction that this is taken, and I agree with much of what Commissioner Bolshevik has been arguing for all along. Understanding there's a slight difference in the presentation that's being made. Where I will disagree with Commissioner Bolshevik, and I do this fairly regularly on this particular item. I'm a different kind of engineer. I'm a trained engineer, but I was a combat engineer. Assets you lose in battle, you never get back. You know, if you use your reserves, you can get them back. So we're in the process of losing assets in battle in the rural patrol area. We're losing people. We're losing things that are never going to come back, no matter how much we conserve our reserves. So I'm not ill opposed to spending not excess reserves, but reserves above a certain amount for rural patrol, because it increases the public confidence in the fact that our sheriff's department is responsive. In the future, when we ask for further funding of the sheriff's department, whether it be in public safety districts or in other types of support for the sheriff's department, the more confidence that people have built in the sheriff's department, the greater the return on that investment when we ask them to help us on that investment. So we disagree slightly on that. I would fund sheriff's deputies for rural patrol out of some of our reserves.
Any other comments? Okay, is there any further presentation for us? Does that kind of wrap up our item for this work session?
I think that concludes it, Chair.
Yeah, and then Christine, do you have any other wrap up? And I don't know if the board needs to actually amend the budget for any of these changes, or yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Buck, Commissioners. So there's no action by you today unless you just want to give me any specific direction to come back to you with that change in the adoption order next Tuesday. So direction on whether you want to follow this change for reserve shifting would be good for me to know. And then pointing back to that sheet that I showed you where the adjustments have been submitted, I would assume that those will be in the adoption order unless you direct otherwise.
So she's asking for some direction on this staff suggested technical adjustments. It sounds to me, from what I've been hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that the technical adjustments presented today are acceptable and could be included in next week's meeting. Correct me if anybody thinks otherwise. Okay. So Christine, do you have enough direction that you need?
I do, thank you.
Very good.
That's all I have.
Okay. So that was our last big item for the day, but we did gloss over, well, I didn't gloss over, we ran out of time. So let's go back to county administration announcements.
I can be very brief, Chair. Just an brief update on grants, because the board had asked that as we're in COVID-19 and we're receiving funds, applying for and receiving funds, that I keep you updated. So I do have a list here, an ongoing list that Mr. Kyler is, as well as a team of others, actually, I should say, we have a grant review team that is tracking all of this. I'm happy to share it with the board if you have questions. I'm not going to go through all of it, other than to say the update from, I believe, the last time I gave you an overview on this is that we have received $778,532 for energy assistance, repair, and weatherization for income-related or income-qualified households. These are direct payments to households with funding originating from the CARES Act. It's pass-through money from the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department sub-allocation methodology by population with a poverty factor. And it augments our existing low-income home energy assistance program. You may have seen last week, we released 2 different grant applications for residents. One was a rental assistance program of a little over $900,000 from the state, which is federal pass-through money. And this other one, the energy assistance, repair, and weatherization for low-income families at $778,000. And then I will say the CRF, the Coronavirus Relief Fund funding, it appears that a portion of the CRF funding will come to Lane County as a lump sum. And so those details are still to come. As the board knows, we applied for reimbursement for expenses. We've spent over $5.5 million on various expenses for COVID-19, and we're seeking reimbursement from state and federal funds for that. And so it's appearing as though those funds will come in a lump sum it has to be expended or obligated by the end of this year. So we'll keep you posted on that. If you have questions about grant funds that we have received, are receiving, or could possibly receive, just let me know.
Okay, any questions on that? All right. Were there any, I'm not sure if Steve Dingle is on the phone, but we didn't get to County Council announcements. Any announcements?
Commissioners, I'm on. I thank you. I wanted to just mention I had some technical difficulties when we were at the end of your rental assistance discussion, and I just wonder. I think it may have been raised, but if it wasn't, this has been the subject among county councils, and there are some definite legal issues involved in that in terms of whether or not it's a taking and whether or not the county government, if they put in moratoriums and those sorts of things, become responsible for uncollected rent and or the collateral consequences that flow from that. For example, damage, or maybe a landlord who goes into foreclosure. And then the other one was the credit thing, which is I would like to do some checking on that because I know that that is also the subject of federal law in a lot of areas. The Federal Fair Reporting Credit Act preempts state and local law on that subject. So those are all issues that need to be explored, I think. And if I understand, if I caught the last part of Commissioner Sorensen, I believe, just before I got cut off, said that it was going to be the subject of perhaps an additional work session. My preference, quite frankly, would be to A, let the state take the lead because then they would be financially responsible, and B, direct payments are always the best just because they don't involve any of these issues of a taking or any of those other things. That's really all I have, and I know we have an exec session. I see Commissioner Bernie is raising his hand.
Mr. Dingle, you may not have heard this. Can you hear me? You may not have heard this, but Commissioner Bozovich, with Commissioner Sorensen and I agreeing, asked that on each of the 5 or 6 items that Sita group recommended we take action on. The last 2 points of each was what would our authority be and what would our liability be. So we want you to weigh in on that spreadsheet on each of those items.
Very Very good. I'll go back and listen to that last part of the meeting so that I understand. But yeah, I just wanted to put that on the board's radar that there are potential legal liabilities for the board depending on what steps or what ordinances you adopt. I'm sorry, and that's all I have. I have no other announcements.
Commissioner Sorensen, sorry, I can't tell on this new thing whether I'm muted or not. I apologize.
Thanks so much. Yeah, every once in a while, I wonder if it's all working out. Thanks for your report, Mr. Dingle. Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on the topic of the additional work session and what we need from you. The previous discussion, if I could just summarize it, is that commissioners are all quite interested in knowing what the limits of our authority are. And I think that Commissioner Bernie did a great job in summarizing that the points that were made in the work session are things that we want to particularly address. The representative from legal aid, I know that's not their official title anymore, but it's something like Oregon Law Center, but they're involved with the tenant group, Springfield Eugene Tenant Association, and they've made a request that we try to get on this in time for when the next big law change will occur. And specifically, I think they used the term 3 weeks in the work session earlier today. So we're going to decide, I guess, later as a group, or maybe the agenda team will decide when that work session will be held. I personally would like to see it done sooner, and it's going to involve some work from Lane County Legal Counsel, because we want to make sure that whatever we're doing in the regulatory realm, comparable to what Multnomah County has done, will be consistent with Oregon law. Thank you.
Commissioner Sorensen, that's right. I understand, and I've actually had some conversations with them, and you're right. I mean, there's the issue of taking it out of this context. Clearly, the government has authority to do certain things, but then that also means that they have to compensate the person for whatever they've done. The best example is condemnation. You can involuntarily take property under certain circumstances, but you have to provide just compensation. And in my conversations with the Multnomah County Council, that definitely was an issue. And part of the difficulty there is trying to estimate what the liability is. Basically, they were unable to do, because they just couldn't figure out at that time how many people, if you did the moratorium, wouldn't, or how long they'd be in there after the time that they would normally be able, a landlord would be able to pursue an FED action, and then what are the potential damages to the landlord. And then the other thing is the collateral ones, which I mentioned, which is damages and or if the landlord, if the person starts moving against their mortgage or their note. So yeah, it's a very complicated issue. I don't think there's any question that the board has the authority. I don't think anyone questioned that. It was, what is the liability for exercising that authority? But I'll look at the assignment.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And the only thing I would like, Chair, is that when we get to the future board assignment requests, that we go over what it is we're asking in this arena, so we can try to help staff narrow down what we are trying to do.
Okay, well, speaking of going to commissioner's business, we'll do that next. After that, we'll do review of assignments, and we do have 2 items, I believe, for emergency business before we exit our meeting for executive session. Commissioner Farr?
Thank you, Chair Buck. I have 2 announcements. One of them is very happy. The other one will start out sounding happy, but is very somber. I'll start with the happy one, which is going to start out sounding somber. The happy one is that we will not have a county fair this summer. That's not happy, that's somber. But we will be using the Midway this summer. Last Thursday, I was at the Fair Board meeting, and the Fair Board heard from the staff regarding how we're going to use the Midway this summer. Coming to the fairgrounds this summer, Midway Movies. It's going to be set up, it'll seem kind of like an old-fashioned drive-in movie theater with a big screen, with food carts, with tune in your radio to get the sound on the movie, and the movies will be playing at the fairgrounds throughout the summer. I hope a lot of people attend, and I hope it's something that we can continue after this year. This is a very special year because we're not having a fair, but we're reminding people that it is still a fairgrounds and it is still a public place for people to gather and have a ton of fun. So I hope people look at, if you go to the Lane County Fairgrounds, the Lane County Fair's Facebook page, you get details of it, or you can go to the website and get more details. The second one, I got a couple of phone calls this morning between 6 and 6:30 a.m. The first one was from my friend Norma Dominguez, who I spoke to for quite some time about a number of issues. The second one was from my one-year-old grandbaby, who calls me Papa. And Xochipilli wanted to speak to Papa this morning because they'd had a sleepover with us over the weekend. And when I was talking to them, they were tapping on the window, waiting for me to walk up to the window because they saw me on the phone and they thought Papa was coming. So it's a very nice conversation. But after I hung up, I remembered something, and something that really is heartbreaking to me. Xochipilli's other Papa, Dionisio Gomez, died 30 years ago. Xochipilli will never see his other Papa. His other Papa was a migrant worker, worked in the fields in California. And back in those days, they didn't always take workers out of the fields before they sprayed or applied chemicals. Dionisio Gomez died of a very aggressive cancer not long after his daughter, my daughter-in-law, Yola Gomez, was born. And Xochipilli Gomez, Far, will never see his other Papa. So it's going to be up to us to remind him of the life of his other Papa. It's easy for him to see me coming through the window on the telephone. He will never see his other Papa. And to me, that's really heartbreaking. You know, I can't really come to grips with it fully and completely. That Dionisio Gomez, I say the name very often, will never see his grandbabies, nor will they ever see him.
Any other announcements? I don't see any. So we'll move to future board assignment requests. Commissioner Sorensen, you had one item you mentioned.
Yes, I wanted to bring up actually two items, so I'll just try to do them in sequence. The first was I wanted to get a board work session on the topic of changing the name of Lane County from Lane County to Lane County. And so I'll just pose that. The reason I'm interested in this topic is a few years ago, I got a letter from a constituent who had done quite a bit of research on Joseph Lane and was upset that Lane County was named for Joseph Lane, and made several suggestions on changing the name of Lane County. And I've looked into the topic of counties changing their name, and there's almost always a huge opposition to it, in part because there's so many businesses that have the name of the county government in their name, and they would then have to change theirs or explain to people why did they name their business after a former U.S. senator who advocated succession rights to states. And so I came across this idea from King County, because they changed their name from Rufus King County to Martin Luther King Jr. County, and thought that the board could embark on this. Recently, I received an email saying, hey, Lane County should, in light of our interest in trying to look for racial justice when we can and what we can do about it, really ought to think about the name change. So I'm interested in a broader name change discussion, but I'm really kind of focused myself on not having Lane County named for Joseph Lane. Incidentally, in the interest of full disclosure, I've received, and this is a long time ago, communications from historians that were opposed to the idea of changing the name of Lane County because they want people to remember the kind of historic context of Lane County and the fact that Joseph Lane was a U.S. Senator from Oregon and a active Democrat and received the Democratic nomination for Vice President of the United States. So I'll just throw that out there. I realize that we're in the middle of apparently two emergencies, a homelessness emergency and a COVID-19 emergency. So it may be that somewhere else, somewhere down the road, but I would like to kick this off by suggesting a work session of unknown duration and of unknown scheduling, leaving that totally up to the agenda team.
Okay, sorry, moving my screen around because I have to plug in also. We need 3 head nods. Oh, there's Commissioner Farr, so we have all 5 of us. So are there any additional head nods for this particular item? Commissioner Sorensen.
Just that I want to keep this fairly loose as a request, but I also don't want it to drop. And I wasn't paying attention to who raised their hand or not, but if there's sufficient votes, I'd like to try to move forward with this.
I'm not seeing enough head nods on that one. What is your second item, Commissioner Sorensen?
Thank you. My second item is to get a little bit more specific with what our next and when our next renter concern about renters is going to happen. And I'll just say that, you know, in the last go around about the budget, we had an opportunity to talk with Mr. Dingle. And I thought Commissioner Burney summarized what it is we need to do. My concern on this one is more timing because of the Springfield Eugene Tenant Association request that we try to jump on this, jump on it from their point, or from our point of view, doing something in 2 to 3 weeks. And we have down weeks coming up. So that means we're going to have to do something fairly heroic to meet their timeline. I don't know if we can, but I just feel like it's our obligation to try to do this.
Any additional head nods for a subsequent conversation about housing that we started today? Commissioner Burney.
I'm unclear in that, yeah, we have a meeting next week and then we're off for 2 weeks. Following that through, so why can't we do this the first week in July? I think what Laurie was saying was that there's, in all likelihood, there will be an e-board meeting or some kind of meeting, and they will know. And she was saying if you want to get ahead of it to buffer any potential lapse of service, that was the time frame. I'm not clear that we can't still take action a few days after that, but I'm not clear on that. I'm not clear on whether we have to push it or not, because basically we have a week, right, to make that time frame.
I think what we would do on the agenda team is try to figure out when to put it into a particular agenda for the week. But I think the bigger question is whether we all want to have a follow-up conversation or not. Got a head nod from Bernie and Sorensen. I'll do a head nod because I think it's a good conversation to continue to have. And then on the agenda team, we'll try to figure out when to fit that in. And Commissioner Sorensen, to be clear, it sounds like this subsequent meeting would be more about the legalities of which items we could or could not do. Is that true for
Well,
the subsequent meeting?
I also asked staff, Stephen Ellis specifically, some difficult questions in our work session earlier today, namely, how big of a problem is this getting to be? We heard, I think, in some ways, I think we heard some conflicting information today. We heard quite a bit of anecdotal, and I might add powerful testimony from renters that they're at the end of their rope already, and yet we also heard from St. Vincent de Paul and Cornerstone that the non-payment was the payment of rent was in the range of 98% of the payments that they have been receiving. So I think that the magnitude of the problem is also something we need to get in on. We know also that we put out the renter application for additional funding last week, and it was oversubscribed within a few hours. So I'm just confused about whether, how big of a problem it is. I fear I believe the anecdotal information that it's a huge problem and it's going to get worse faster. And as was pointed out by Laurie, the cost of putting people out on the street and then providing them with services as homeless people, it just dwarfs the whole thing. And so if we're going to follow through on the TAC report idea that it's cheaper to keep people in some sort of housing rather than making them homeless or having them become homeless, we got to get on it. So I'd say it's not only the legal component of it, of what can we do legally, but it's also what is the magnitude of the problem in the view of staff, so that we can decide what else we need to do about it. So it's more data collection, and it's in light of the moving target that we're facing. I see some signs that the economy is coming back. We actually had a favorable national job report the other day, the only bit of good news on the economy in months, but still, we have had fewer people lose their jobs. So I'm not really sure what the picture is, and I think that the staff that deals with housing, that deals with poverty and homelessness, can well add to the legal thing. I certainly get the idea that breaking it into bite-sized chunks might be good, and having just a whole session on what's within our power and what isn't, and having Mr. Dingle and Lane County Legal Aid present on those topics, I think would be really good. Thanks.
Okay, so we have two items on that follow-up, which is what can we do legally, and then how big is the problem. So I've got 3 head nods for that. We'll put that on there. Any other future board requests? Commissioner Farr, and then Commissioner Burney.
Thank you, Chair Buck. And I mentioned this earlier, and I said it's not an assignment necessarily for Mr. Mokrahajski, and that is that the sheriff give us a report back or a brief on the COVID protocol in the Lane County Jail. That could, Mr. Mokrahajski, that could take place perhaps during next week's COVID discussion. I think the sheriff may be prepared to do it at that point in time. It doesn't take any Lane County staff preparation, I don't believe, other than within the sheriff's department. So maybe Chair Buck, you and Vice Chair Burney with Mr. Mokrahajski could take a look at that and see if that can be not necessarily a formal, perhaps an informal part of the COVID discussion next week, how the Lane County Jail is working with the protocol throughout the pandemic of the COVID. And the second, this is new, I didn't mention this morning, but we're hearing a lot about the use of force in police departments. And we've been watching pretty closely the Lane County Sheriff's Department and how it's severely understaffed, particularly in rural patrol. I'd informally ask the sheriff if he'd be prepared to talk about use of force in the Sheriff's Department in a, once again, not a large agenda item, and not one that would take any preparation by the staff. But I'd like to suggest that as a future agenda item that the Sheriff's Department could talk about Lane County Sheriff protocol in use of force.
Okay. Do we have enough head nods on those items? Got a head nod for me? I see a couple other head nods, so I think we're good on both those items. Commissioner Burney.
Without the head nods, I was going to say I'm happy to take orders from an Army engineer. I want to clarify for the item Commissioner Sorensen was mentioning. I have a desire to take action on the recommendations of Sita. We have to have information before we can take action. That to me would be the reason for the work session. And I requested specifically, now this has to be, if there is a cost to the county on an item by item basis, what that would be, what the positives of taking action would be for the county, what the negatives might be, what it would require from the county. And then Commissioner Bozovich added, we should also know from council the authority, whether we have authority to do that, and what, if any, our liability would be. So I'm hoping that defines a spreadsheet that we could look at so that when we next have a work session, we can take action. Thank you.
Okay. Next, just final ask, any other future board assignment requests? Okay. We had a lot there, so we'll go to review of assignments and then emergency business after that.
So I have a request for a quarterly update on the equity plan. I have a report from the sheriff on COVID-19 in the jail. And I have a report from the sheriff on use of force. And then what I'm not clear on is the request from, I thought Commissioner Sorensen related to the rental assistance. What exactly are we coming back with? I heard a request for legal analysis. Okay, now I'm unmuted. There's a ghost muter. Anyway, so if I got that right, that it's a report back from legal counsel on the ability on what options we have available to pursue, but I just want to clarify that item. No? Can you not hear me, or can I not hear you? Okay.
Can anybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
now. Yes, yes.
Sorry, I need
You
to
were just
learn
going to have
sign
to listen to
language.
me for the next hour, I guess.
I can hear everybody, but it didn't work. We're having clearly problems with our platform today.
Heather, I just want to say that I was trying to say something to answer, but we were muted. I think it said you were muted by someone else. So some of the time I was muted by myself, but some of the time I was muted by somebody else. And so
Sounds like a conspiracy.
No, it's not. It's just the technology. It's difficult, and I think we're doing pretty good given the all the problems. But I just want to say, when you said, "Can anybody hear me?" I'm like, I can hear you, but you can't hear me say I can hear you. So anyway, over and out.
We need to have hand signals if something happens like this, I think. So I don't think we've fully clarified what you need yet, Steve, on that assignment, but I know Commissioner Burney had a lot of items. Do you want to address that, Commissioner Burney?
Yeah. Not that everyone agreed with me, but I thought I literally just went through that prior to Steve asking the question, what the hell do you mean by that? So I'm going to do this again, but again, it doesn't mean that the board agrees with me. A spreadsheet with information so that we can take action on the recommendations or not based on the information we get. And the spreadsheet would be organized on an item by item in terms of the Sita recommendations that identifies a cost, if there is any, to the county for implementing, what the positives for the county would be by implementing, what the negatives for the county would be by implementing, what, if any, required action from the board that would take, the legal authority we have to either make or not make that action, and what, if any, liability would the county incur if, in fact, we approved them recommendation by recommendation. I'm sorry.
I certainly agree with those as part of the follow-up. So I'm not sure if that clarifies everything needed.
And I think 80% of that work can be done by Oregon Legal Aid or whatever Laurie and John Vandekamp's organization is actually called.
Okay, so we can work on pulling that together, and I think we're looking at July 7th would be the earliest, because since you have a meeting next week and then are down for 2 weeks, I don't think we'll be able to pull that together by next week. So I think we'll be looking at July 7th at the earliest. So that's all I had.
Okay, we'll move on to emergency business. Mr. Mokryski.
We have 2 items, and I think we have folks on the line, unless they're muted by our ghost muter. Karen Gaffney, are you there?
I am.
Okay.
So do you want me to take my item first? All right, I will do that. Thank you, commissioners, for a very long day. I know you still have a lot in front of you. Thinking about Commissioner Farr and happy news. What I have for you today as emergency business is happy news. And that is asking for you to approve a contract amendment with the state of Oregon for our rent relief funding that the e-board allocated on Friday afternoon. It is very good news. Unfortunately, it's coming to you as emergency business because the state notified us yesterday that we have to sign the contract and get it back to them by noon tomorrow. So given the amount of this particular contract, we do need to come to the board and ask for your delegated authority in order to have the county administrator sign that. So that is good news for us. And on an only slightly related note, but because it's good news, I also will share with you that this afternoon, Steve Manila notified me that HUD has just sent out a press release that they're releasing their remaining $2.96 billion in CARES Act funding for homeless populations related to coronavirus. So Oregon is anticipated to get $49 million of that money. So I'm hoping to be able to continue to come back to you with opportunities to accept these resources into Lane County that will really enable us to make a substantive difference in our community. Happy to answer any questions, but I know you've talked a lot about this money that's coming through the state, so I won't belabor the point unless you have questions.
Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you. So this is basically the 6 to 7 million I was talking about earlier today. That's well beyond the 900,000 we originally got. Are we planning on utilizing Homes for Good to distribute this, or are we going to try and do this through our nonprofit CAP partners that are not necessarily set up to distribute rent assistance?
I think that's a great question. Oops, and I'm hearing feedback. All right, so I'm going to try that one more time. And I actually had a conversation with Steve Manella over the lunch break about that question. And you know, it's our belief that a blended system really makes the most sense. Clearly, our shared objective is to get these resources into the hands of people who need it as quickly as possible. And I know he's reached out to Homes for Good to talk about, given all of the administrative requirements on these dollars, in what way would they like to participate in that? So I think there's an opportunity to do work with a whole host of partners to really help us be able to get this out in as efficient a way as possible.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that.
Commissioner Bernie?
I just want to say that I'm not used to being able to get involved in the mechanics of fund distribution, but I agree wholeheartedly that, and you're doing this, Karen, as is Steve Manella, as is the group. You're assessing the fastest way to get money out. You're going to be utilizing existing service delivery groups that are in place. It may even help them increase their capacity to do more of this. And there will be a gap there, and you guys will figure out the fastest way to get the money to the people that need it. So thank you very much.
Commissioner Farr?
Thank you, Chair Buck, and thank you, Karen, for that great news. I'm not sure how I'm going to vote on that, by the way. Oh, wait, yeah, I am. But the, you know, having Homes for Good involved in distribution makes a great deal of sense. I'm not sure, I think you've come to the conclusion that not in the entire distribution, that using other partners to help distribute makes more sense. And since I would guess that some of it's going to be distributed through non-profit means, it makes sense to spread out the distribution. So thank you.
Okay, do we need a motion? And it sounds like we do. Is there any specific language that you need, Karen?
And I'm sorry, I know Diana published the packet, but we do have an order and packet that I'm hoping you have in front of you in the matter of approving a contract amendment with the state of Oregon for COVID rent relief funding and delegating authority to the county administrator to sign the amendment.
Okay, I would entertain a motion to approve.
I want to second Commissioner Farr's motion.
Then it's incumbent upon me to make a motion to approve. Thank you.
Second.
Okay, motion approved by Commissioner Farr and second by Commissioner Bernie. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Saying aye a lot.
We got 2 votes on that one, and they were both unanimous.
I don't see any opposition, so that passes unanimously. I do have the other motion up on my screen now, which is item 14B, order 20-06-09-07, in the matter of approving a contract amendment with the state of Oregon for COVID rent relief funding and delegating authority to the county administrator to sign the amendment. I entertain a motion to approve.
I think that's the one we just did.
We did that, yeah.
So we're sorry, we took them out of order.
You did them out. I'm sorry for repeating that.
Well, we voted on that twice.
You voted on it. We're good.
Well, the problem, I move to reconsider.
Interrupt me when I do that.
Karen wasn't muted, but Alex was muted by the ghost muter. So now, Alex, are you there?
I am. I'm here.
Okay, Alex has been unmuted by the ghost muter, so now he's available. We're just trying to throw you off today.
Go
okay,
ahead,
well, I'm before you with a slightly different item. It's a letter of support for a grant that has been made available via the CARES Act. The Congress appropriated money to the Economic Development Administration for COVID response treatment and prevention. And the University of Oregon has been working with the county to create a plan whereby they will be involved in direct testing for coronavirus. And so they are putting forward about $1 million proposal to the Economic Development Administration. Their plan is to submit it tomorrow, and they're seeking a letter of support, which is included in the item under emergency business this afternoon. And so my recommendation is that you do go ahead and support this proposal. As I said, public health staff have been working with the university on this project, and other staff have also been discussing with the university greater collaboration with respect to COVID related response and recovery issues.
Commissioner Sorensen.
I move approval of the order as presented.
Second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner Sorensen and second by Commissioner Burney. Any discussion? All right, I don't see any, so we'll go to a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, say nay. Okay, we are all in favor of signing the letter. I won't repeat it all over again this time.
Thank you, board.
Okay. So with that, we are going to move into our executive session. So I'm going to read us in. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations and to consult with counsel regarding the rights and duties of a public body with regard to litigation or litigation likely to be filed. Excuse me. The executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.660 subsection 2, subsection D and H, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. We reserve the right to come back out into public session should the need arise. I don't see of any need to come back out in public session at this point, but we do reserve that right. We will need, I see Commissioner Farr needs to have a statement before we go into break.
Notice I did
I'll
not
break for about 5 minutes.
ask about the
And
county.
Commissioner Burney, we can hear you there. I'll have Commissioner Farr make a statement and then we'll give us 5 minutes to log into the exec session. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. I'd like to declare a potential conflict of interest with the discussion surrounding AFSCME. My son is a mental health therapist and is a member of the AFSCME union. I do not perceive an actual statutory conflict of interest, so I will engage in the discussion during the executive session.
Okay, well, with that, we are in recess with our regular board, and in 5 minutes, we'll all log into the new session for the exec session. See you all there.